Okay, we'll just start with a little bit of background on who Zyxel is, because let's be honest, Zyxel is not a household name. However, we have been doing this for a long time. We got started all the way back in 1989 in the United States, which is where our Anaheim headquarters is. So that's Anaheim is where our tech support's at. It's where our warehouse is at. It's where most of our sales team is located and everything else. So you did hear that right. We do have our own tech support team, and they are based here out of our Anaheim office. So when you call in for support during normal business hours, you will get a Zyxel employee based out of California here. If you call in during some of our off hours, we do transfer you to our German office for initial contact, troubleshooting, and to then set up an appointment for a callback. So particularly for those of you on the East Coast, if you hear somebody with a German accent, that is why you've been transferred to our German office. But again, it is still Zyxel employees. It is not an outsourced call center. Over the years, we've put out over 100 million different devices out in the field. We serve 150 different markets. So the Anaheim office is based here, based in Anaheim is for North America, so Canada and the US. We do have other offices serving other parts of the country, including Central America and Mexico, which are handled by our Guatemalan office. Our main area where we do most of our business is based out of Europe. So that's where most of our business is done these days as far as sales goes. Our corporate headquarters is based out of Hsinchu, Taiwan. So we are a Taiwanese company. And 70% of our R&D is done at our facilities there in Taiwan. The rest is sort of spread around in China, Germany. And I think we've still got a few engineers based out of Silicon Valley here in California as well. So I'm going to start before we talk about hardware, talking about sort of software. And we'll talk starting with Nebula, which is our cloud management platform. And it's something that touches all of our main product categories for you. So Nebula was the first cloud management platform that was aimed at the SMB space. Back when we launched in 2016, there were several different vendors making cloud management platforms, and they were all pretty much targeting the enterprise space. We saw those cool features that they had and thought, this would be perfect for our SMB type VARs. So we got to work on it and we launched it in 2016, and we've been improving it and upgrading it ever since. So Nebula is free to use. There are no limits to the number of devices you can manage in our Nebula Cloud, the number of customers you can manage in our Nebula Cloud for free. Now, we do offer licenses which unlock additional features, and I'll touch briefly on them today in a future slide. But we do have a dedicated Nebula webinar we do almost every month. So if you want to learn more about Nebula in particular, that might be a good one to join. So the Nebula infrastructure is really interesting here. So it gives you a centralized, unified place to manage all of your customers and all of your devices. So you've got a single pane of glass. You log in at nebula.zyxel.com. All of your customers are there. All of their networks are there. Choose the customer and network you want to manage, and all of their Nebula compatible devices are viewable through that interface. So you don't have to, do port forwarding, set up VPNs, things like that. The Nebula agent is built into our hardware itself. So there's nothing additional you have to do to use our cloud. There's no cloud keys, CNA devices. There's no software or virtual machines you have to install everywhere. You simply plug in the hardware, give it power and an internet connection, and you can manage it in the cloud. Zero touch provisioning. There's no configuration that needs to be done on our switches and our access points in general. Gateways and our security switches are just a little bit different. We won't really go into that today. But the cloud itself, the instance, is hosted on Amazon AWS for reliability reasons. So it's not something that we've built ourselves in-house. It's not hosted on our own servers. It is a distributed network across the globe through Amazon AWS. The hardware communicates with our cloud as far as storing logs, gathering configuration changes, firmware updates, etc. None of your customers' personal data goes into our cloud. Local traffic stays on the local network. Traffic going out to the internet goes directly out to the internet, just like it would on any other network. So there are no issues with PCI or HIPAA or things like that. So Nebula's been designed to get you up and running in just a few minutes. You simply log into nebula.zyxel.com, say you want to create a new network. So each of your customers you will set up as what we call an organization, and then you create sites for that customer under that organization. And we've got a number of wizards that are set there to get sort of the basic settings going and things up and running for you. You can start configuring your devices. General settings can be configured basically at any point after you create the customer and site in Nebula. And then once you do get the hardware, you can simply scan the QR code on the outside of the box and assign that to your Nebula network. And then you can do all of the configuration that you need without needing to take the hardware out of the box. So once you do get the hardware on site and installed, it will connect to the cloud and download its configuration. So Nebula Control Center, that's our interface here. This is what you're using to manage all your devices. It's been designed from the ground up with the idea that you're going to have multiple customers that need to be managed and that they may have multiple sites within that. So basically the steps for using Nebula are basically log in, create your organization, which again is your customer, and then their sites. Scan the QR codes for the hardware, assign them to those customers, connect the Nebula devices, and then you're good to go for management. And again, the core version of Nebula is absolutely free. So some questions we get from people, does my whole network need to be Nebula? And the answer to that is no. You can mix Nebula hardware with non-Nebula hardware. It's just, if it's Nebula hardware, you can manage it in the Nebula cloud. If it's not Nebula hardware, you would manage it how you would traditionally manage that, going directly into it through a web GUI, SSH, whatever it happens to be for management. Do you need to use a Zyxel gateway to do captive portal and guest access? And the answer to that is no. Captive portal and guest functionality is built directly into our access points. So if you have a customer with an existing switches and gateway, you can simply add Zyxel access points, manage them in Nebula, and set those up to run captive portal or whatever, irregardless of what's going on the rest of the network. And we do have the ability to do NAT based on SSID. So you can put, for instance, guests to your network on their own subnet separate from the rest. We also have something called layer 2 isolation. So if you don't have VLANs to isolate out that guest network, layer 2 isolation will prevent those guests from being able to send any packets to anything else on the network other than the router. So again, we get a lot of questions about privacy. So Nebula can be used in HIPAA solutions, PCI solutions. We are GDPR compliant, which is a big regulation over in Europe that's really strict. And then who hosts our cloud? It's Amazon AWS. So when we first launched Nebula, we kind of followed the Meraki system where we had a set of hardware that just does cloud, and we had a set of hardware for traditional management. For the most part, we have phased that out and instead replaced it with Nebula Flex. Basically one line of hardware that can be managed either the traditional way or it can be managed in the cloud, giving you the flexibility to be able to standardize on one set of hardware and manage it in the cloud as needed based on your customer's demands or your own personal preference. So you will also see products labeled Nebula Flex Pro. So for the most part, if a product is labeled Nebula Flex Pro, the only difference between it and regular Nebula Flex is it comes bundled with 1 year of our Nebula Pro Pack license, which is an optional license, and we'll talk a little bit more about it coming up here. But it's primarily aimed at unlocking additional features aimed at those of you providing managed services, things like storing a year's worth of logs in the cloud, having an audit log for configuration changes, alerts when devices go offline, things like that. The one exception to that is our access points. Our access points, if you go up to Pro, also unlock our local controller management. So if you're deploying wireless access points, you do not want to use the cloud. You want to manage them with a local controller. We can do that, but you want to buy the Nebula Flex Pro hardware. Only the Nebula Flex Pro hardware works with the local controller. I know it's kind of weird, but that's the way it works. So as we mentioned, Nebula hardware, Nebula Flex can operate in standalone or cloud mode. Putting it in cloud mode is real easy. It requires you do nothing to the hardware itself. You simply log into Nebula add the devices to your Nebula account, add them to a customer's network, and our hardware will automatically reboot itself into cloud mode and download the cloud-hosted configuration. If at any point you decide you no longer want to manage that device in the cloud, you simply log into Nebula, remove the device from the Nebula cloud, and a few minutes later, that device will reboot itself in standalone mode. Now, a key thing here to keep in mind is configuration settings are not kept between the two different modes. So if you put it into cloud mode, it will automatically download and overwrite whatever configuration it currently has with whatever is set in the cloud, and vice versa. When you then set it back to standalone mode, it will put itself back into default settings. So you will need to do a reconfiguration. Now, we'll talk a little bit about licenses here. So the free version of Nebula we call Base Pack. We have Plus Pack, which is sort of a light version. It unlocks some extra features, a little extra log storage in the cloud, a few extra admin accounts, email alerts. So those are part of Plus. And then Pro has basically everything that's in Plus, plus a lot more stuff, again, aimed primarily at those of you providing managed services. Gives you access to things like advanced firmware scheduling. So with free version of Nebula, you can do basic scheduling. With Pro, you can do advanced scheduling where you can set individual schedules based on individual pieces of hardware. You can do it by class of hardware, things like that. So for those licenses, Plus and Pro Pack, to use them, every device in that organization needs to have an active license. So if you don't have enough active licenses, you will not be able to use Nebula Pro or Plus until you add those licenses, and it will tell you how many licenses you need to buy. And if at some point, some of the licenses expire, but not all of them, we do send you notifications, and we give you a 15-day grace period after the expiration of the licenses to add the proper licenses back in. But if you don't do that, what happens is your organization just switches back to the free version. It's not like some of the other cloud services where you lose access to your devices if you're not paying or if your licenses expire. We simply drop you back to the free version of Nebula. And then on top of that, we have a different type of license called the Nebula MSP pack. And basically, this is a license for individual admin accounts. So you assign this license to an admin account. That admin account gets access to these extra features. If you have multiple admin accounts that you want to have access to these features, you do have to buy multiple licenses, one per admin account that has access to these extra features. And as the name implies, these are features aimed at those of you providing MSP services. So it gives you the ability to do cross-organization management. It allows you to get email alerts for all of your customers, even those using the free version of Nebula. It allows you to replace the Zyxel branding in the interface with your own company's branding. It allows you to remove our tech support contact information and replace it with your tech support information. So some interesting features there for those of you that are an MSP. You may be interested in that MSP license. So Nebula works with pretty much all of our main classes of hardware. The Nebula Flex, that's all of our access points that start with the letter N. It works with our switches. It works with the 1915, the 1920s, and the 1930 series switches. Our new SCR50AXE lightweight security router, it is a Nebula Flex product. And then our USG Flex and regular USG Flex hardware. If you're buying the standalone hardware, that is Nebula Flex. It should be noted here with the USG Flex H series, it will be Nebula Flex. It at the moment cannot be managed directly in Nebula. It'll be a future update to it. Going to Nebula Pro, that would be any of our access points that start with the letter W. And then on the switch side of things, it would be our 1350 series. It's our security switches, and then the 2220 and the 3800 series switches. And then on the security routers, our ATP series, which is sold with a bundled gold license. That gold license includes Nebula Pro. And then the USG Flex series, including the H. If you buy the version that's bundled with UTM services, that bundle also includes a Pro license. And then our LTE outdoor router, that also includes a Pro license. So that's it as far as Nebula goes. I'm going to talk now a little bit about our wireless products. So short version here, we've got a bunch of different access points that are out there. We're in the process right now of just recently launched Wi-Fi 7, and we're slowly going to be phasing out some of our older 11AC access points. So the lineup that you see here will be changing, and some of those pieces of hardware may be harder to find than others at the moment. As we go through the transition process, we will have more Wi-Fi 7 APs next year. But basically, we break up our access points into three categories. Over here on the right, these are our W series access points. These are our Nebula Flex Pro APs, and most of these include one of our special antenna technologies in them. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, anything with an S that ends in the letter S is going to be a smart antenna access point. Anything that ends in the letter D is going to have dual optimized antennas. Then we've got our flexible series and our simple series. Both of these are Nebula Flex, so they can be managed in the cloud. The difference here is the NWA 50 and 90 series. These are sort of more of a prosumer type access point. They're generally, around $100 and less, except for the outdoor one. They can be Nebula managed, but they are missing some features that maybe businesses would like captive portal, um, WPA enterprise encryption, load balancing, things like that. So those are just meant to be inexpensive. They come with a 2-year warranty. And then the NWAs that are 3 digits, so the 100 series and the 200 series, these ones are going to be the full feature set. They have basically the full features software wise as the Ultimate series here does. So if you don't need Nebula Flex Pro, you don't need our additional antenna technologies, these are the models you would be looking at. And basically, the flexible and Ultimate series are lifetime warranty. Even the little cheap ones here, like this guy here is sub $100, lifetime warranty. Part of the reason we can do that is our design philosophy when it comes to our access points. At our trade shows, we used to carry some of our access points and some Ubiquity access points and some Ruckus access points. And we'd let you feel them and we'd let you open them up so you could see what the difference is. And one of the things you would find is ours weigh a lot more. So why is that? It has to do with how we've designed them. So our design philosophy is based on longevity and on performance. So what you will see done differently with us than some of the other guys is, for instance, we do not use any electrolytic capacitors. We only use solid state capacitors. Those are less likely to fail and have a longer life to them. A very common cause of failure on these access points or on any sort of solid state technology is something called heat fatigue. So to help combat that, we have a giant metal heat sink that goes behind our main board that's designed to draw the heat out of the components and off the board and vent them through a bunch of vent holes on the top of the housing. If you look at some of our cheaper competitors with shorter warranties, they don't even have vent holes for the heat to escape, let alone a giant metal heat shield or heat sink to pull the heat off. You will also see we have a lot more shielding on our board than most of our competition, and that's because we've added 4G and 5G filtering on there or shielding on there to prevent interference. So in a typical home, not going to make a difference, but if you're deploying wireless in a large office building, generally your cellular signal from outside can't make it very far into the building. So businesses use something called DAS to bring in the signal and distribute the signal inside the building. And when those are, within 20, 30 feet of an access point, those signals can bleed over and cause Wi-Fi interference. So our extra shielding helps prevent that. In addition to that, unlike even our more expensive competitors, we do not put our antennas directly on the main PCBA. Instead, they are on their own board, separate from the main PCBA, and on most models, there's going to be a metal shield behind them to help create additional isolation between the antennas and what's going on the board. When you're close to the AP, you've got a good strong signal, not going to make a difference. But when you're in those edge cases, that border where you're just barely getting a good enough signal, this can be the difference between a slow but reliable signal or connection and a really frustrating connection. So on to the technology. So one of the technologies I mentioned is dual optimized antenna. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on the question and answer, but I believe we are the only vendor offering this. So what happens is your traditional AP is designed to be mounted on the ceiling above the area to be covered. So because of that, the antennas that are built in are optimized with that in mind, and they radiate the signal out in what's largely a circular pattern aimed slightly downwards to help cover the area below them. In the real world, however, you don't always get to mount your access points there. Oftentimes you have to mount them on a wall someplace. So they're rotated 90 degrees from where they're intended to be as far as the coverage pattern goes, and you get less than ideal coverage. You send a lot of the signal up into the ceiling, down into the floor, where it either gets wasted or can cause interference on a multi-floor building, depending on what that floor is made out of. So our solution to that is the dual optimized antenna. So access points that end in the letter D have two sets of antennas. One that's optimized for your traditional ceiling mount, one that's optimized for wall placement. And you can choose in the software based on where you've deployed that particular access point, which antennas to use to optimize it for your installation. The other technology we have is called smart antenna. And our smart antenna technology, smart antenna is kind of a generic term, is similar to the Ruckus Beamflex Plus, um, which replaces that fixed antenna pattern, or the two sets of two sets of antenna patterns in our dual optimized antenna, with the ability to go through literally hundreds of different antenna patterns. So the algorithm we use not only focuses the signal in the direction of where the client is in relation to the access point, our algorithm takes into account other sources of RF interference and helps ignore them so that interference doesn't affect the access point as much as it would elsewhere. So this works with any type of client device. There's nothing special required from the client, and it works with mobile clients. So as clients move around in the environment, it will work for them. So when it comes to smart antenna technology, we've been offering it for quite a few years now. A while back, the University of Brescia in Italy, they decided to investigate claims made by us and Ruckus about smart antenna and compared us to Cisco and HP Aruba, who do not have smart antenna technology. And what they found is in a real world environment where there are sources of co-channel interference, up to 70% better performance with smart antenna technology. And in our case, even compared to Ruckus, up to a 45% better performance in that in a RF prone environment. So if you Google for this, we've got a white paper that usually comes up. Just type in Zyxel smart antenna white paper, it'll come up. And we've got a link to the entire report that the University of Brescia's networking group did. So you can see how they did their tests and every test they did and all their results. Our access points also have the ability to offer some what I'm going to call UTM Lite security features. So this is called Connect and Protect. This is a license you buy, and each AP that you want to have this feature needs to have a license, but not all of your APs need to have this. So you can, apply this just to those access points you want to have this feature. And basically what it does is it uses IP-based reputation filtering to provide UTM-like security. So it can block, phishing sites, sites that host malware, things like that. So this is a feature that you can have. The products that have Connect and Protect Plus, in addition to that UTM Lite ability, also give you the ability to create bandwidth throttling on an application basis, where normally our access points only do, bandwidth limitation on a per user basis. So that is it for access points. And again, if you have questions, send them in using question and answer interface in Zoom. I'll now start talking about our switches. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is we've got a lot of different switches. As a general rule, as the model number gets bigger, the amount of features our switches support increases. The one exception to this is the 1350 series, which is sort of out doing its own thing separate from anybody else. So rather than go through all of our different switch SKUs, I just want to hit some of the high level key things here. And I want to start by talking about the switch naming. So when you look at the switch naming, it goes a long ways to explaining to you what the switch offers. So you can use that when you're browsing a distribution or browsing the price list we send out. You can use that to quickly sort of narrow down which switches you might be considering for a particular application. So if the switch starts with the letters ES, all ports on that switch are just fast Ethernet. So not a lot of those around these days. GS switches are best-selling switches. GS tells you that that switch, all of the ports are 1 gig. MG series switches, it's telling you that all the ports are multi-gig on that switch. So if you need multi-gig on all of your ports, you're looking for an MG switch. An XS series switch, all of the ports are usually 10 gig. In some cases, it can be a mix between 10 gig and multi-gig ports. Generally, the XS series is going to be a higher end, more feature-rich series than the MG series. The XGS series are going to be switches where most of the ports are 1 gig, but there are 10 gig uplink ports on it. And then XMG series switches, all of the ports are multi-gig, but there are also 10 gig uplink ports on it. The next thing to look at is the suffix. What letters does the model number end in? If it ends in HP, that's telling you that that switch provides PoE, and it's either PoE plus or PoE plus plus support. EP are generally PoE plus, but they have a lower power budget. So this is for those of you that maybe need a lot of ports on your switch, but you don't need a lot of PoE ports. The EP series will be a little bit cheaper for you because it's got a lower power budget than the standard HP series. And then the FP series are for those of you that need a lot more PoE power than most other people. So FP tells you that there's a higher power budget built in on that switch than the HP series. And then if the switch just ends in the letter F, that's telling you that all ports on that switch are fiber. There are no copper ports on that switch. So now we'll go back to this chart here where we go through all of the different models and stuff here. So the 1000 and 110 series switches, these are all unmanaged switches. Most of the 1100 switches are rack mountable, but not all of them. 1200 series are where we've got some basic light web management. None of these switches are rack mountable, and they're more of your, Soho, single, small office type switch. 1900 series, that's where we start getting into our lower end rack mounted switches. And again, most of these switches can be rack mounted. And they provide web management, and they provide more features than the 1200 series does. Going up from the 1200 or the 1900 series is the 1915s. So the 1915 series switches are going to be the cheapest switches we have that support Nebula Flex. So if you're using Nebula and you want to manage your switches in Nebula, you will need to buy something 1915 or higher. So think of the 1915s as almost like a 1900 series, but with Nebula support. The 1920 series is where we get up to our true layer 2 switches. These are web manageable or Nebula manageable. The 1930 series is basically similar to the 1920s, but the 1930 series generally offers 10 gig ports, where the 1920 series generally doesn't have any 10 gig ports. So if you need 10 gig uplinks and you need Nebula or layer 2, look at the 1930 series. And then our GS2220 series, that's probably our best-selling switches out there. These are your traditional layer 2 plus, or some vendors will call them layer 3 light or just layer 3. These are your traditional, business class switches. They have the web interface. They support Nebula Flex Plus. They also have command line interface. So for those of you guys that like writing your own scripts and interfacing directly with the switches, 2220 series and higher is where you want to go. And then on the high end here, we have our, layer 3 and aggregation switches, the 3800 and 4600 series. And then I did mention that the 1350s are sort of their own thing. So these are switches that were custom built for those of you doing IP cameras. They have a number of features that were designed and added in there for you, such as the ability to monitor connected devices. And if these stop responding to LLDP or ping, they can power cycle those devices to reboot them up. You can apply configuration changes or reboot the switch without the PoE power cutting out. Some additional features like that. So just to highlight here again, if they're Nebula Flex, which again, anything 1915 and higher pretty much is, you can use them in standalone or cloud managed mode. I think a key thing to talk about here is for everything I think 1900 series and higher, we are using Zynos, which is an in-house developed OS. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of switches, especially the cheaper switches you can buy out there, are generally not customized software. They are generally basically running whatever the software is that the chipset vendor puts out or the ODM puts on there, with maybe some branding differences. So you end up in situations where, you buy one switch, it's got one interface. You buy a different model of switch, it's got a different interface. So with us using Zynos is we give you a unified interface across all of those different series of switches because we're loading our own software in there with our own GUI, our own feature naming and stuff like that. So everything is going to be consistent. And then just like our access points, we've designed our most of our switches here to be heavy duty to handle a lot of what's going on out there in the real world and prevents a lot of the common causes of failure on our switches. Because of that, pretty much all of our switches now are lifetime warranty. And then I want to talk a little bit here really quickly about PoE, because this is becoming more and more of an issue here now that the Wi-Fi 7's here and some of the higher end Wi-Fi 6E access points are here. And what's basically happening is a lot of your PoE devices now require more PoE power than maybe you're used to providing. So traditional PoE 802.3 AF can provide up to 15.4 watts of PoE power at the port. PoE Plus 802.3 AT upgrades that to up to 30 watts of power per port. And now we've got a lot more devices out there. We've got these, high speed 3 radio access points, maybe some, pan tilt zoom cameras with infrared on them. They require more than 30 watts of power each. So for those types of devices, you need what we call PoE or what you will see called 802.3 BT. And they can provide up to 60 watts of power per device. So that's something to keep in mind when you're buying some of the newer higher end equipment out there. It may not work or may not operate at full speed if you're providing just PoE or PoE plus on your switches. So you may need to upgrade the PoE on your network to power those access points, or use something like a PoE injector that's got the higher wattage support. Most of our switches support what we call a smart PoE consumption mode. We've used a couple different terms over the years for marketing materials. And basically what happens is when a device connects to a PoE switch, it identifies to the switch what class of device it is. And then the switch is supposed to allocate and reserve power based on that class. So if a device says I'm a class 3 device, your switch will reserve 15.4 watts of power for that device, whether it needs all 15.4 or not. And where you start running into trouble with this is with PoE Plus, there's only one class, 4, which reserves 30 watts of power. So you have a lot of devices out there that require only 16, 17, 18 watts of power, but they're reserving 30 watts of power per device, and that eats up your PoE budget on the switch where it doesn't necessarily need to. So our consumption mode is the solution to this. Basically, we monitor the PoE power draw of the device, and generally most power is needed at boot up. And then we say, wait a minute, like in this case here, this PoE IP phone, it's a class 3 device. So it's requiring 15.4 watts of power be reserved for it, but it in actuality only needs 9 watts. So our switches will be able to determine that it only needs 9 and free up the additional 6 watts of power for other devices. So to give you an idea here, we've got a 24 port switch. We're plugging in 24 of these phones. If we use just the standard PoE class system, it would require a switch with a PoE budget of 370 watts. But with our consumption mode, you only actually need a switch with a PoE budget of 216 watts. So you can get a cheaper switch. You can, add more devices to the same switch, however you want to do it, thanks to our consumption mode. And then just to hit in here real quick, we do have PoE power injectors. We have a 30-watt power injector with a 2.5 gig Ethernet ports on it, and we have a 60-watt PoE injector with a 5 gig port on it, copper, to be able to provide PoE power to some of these higher-end devices without having to swap out your entire switch. And then just to hit here really quick, that 1350 security series switch, we do have a 6 HP model, which can support a single PoE++ device on it. And these all have all those extra features I was talking about. To use some of these extra features in Nebula, it does require a pro license. And then again, the 1915 series here is going to be our most inexpensive Nebula compatible switches that we have available for you. And then for those of you needing 10 gig, we have the XS 1930 and the XMG 1930 series to give you those 10 gig ports. And then lastly, again, I've already talked about it, just the 2220 series is sort of, our traditional business class switch. And then we've just got a quick comparison here showing you if you do need multi-gig, we've got a number of different switches here. The MG series switches provide 2.5 gig ports on them. They're an unmanaged switch. The XGS 1010 is an unmanaged switch, which has a combination of 2.5 gig and 10 gig ports on it. XGS 1210 and 1250. So again, XGS is telling you that it has 10 gig and has 1 gig ports on it, and maybe some multi-gig ports as well. And because it's 1200 series, it's web managed versus the 1010 here. So it's a 10 series or 100,000 series. So that's not managed. And then up here with our true business class switches here, we have the 1930s and the 2220 XGS 2220s. Moving on to security. Not the most complex as far as models go. There's nowhere near as many models as we have on our switches, but we are sort of in the process of transitioning between models. So I want to talk about that just a little bit. Some of the things we do a little bit differently than the other guys. Our security appliances have now been ICSA certified for 22 years in a row. So ICSA is an independent organization that tests and certifies security appliances. I believe they are currently owned by Verizon. It didn't always used to be that way, but again, it's independent testing to let you know that you can trust our firewall devices. So when it comes to our security appliances, we have the USG Flex series, the ATP series, and the SCR series. So the ATP series is going away. For the most part, that's being phased out. Many of those have already completely been sold through distribution, but there's still probably some floating around out there. So USG Flex was our traditional UTM security appliance. The ATP series was what we call advanced threat protection. Instead of providing normal signature-based UTM services, we used artificial intelligence and cloud-based sandboxing to identify zero-day threats and provide faster response times when it comes to security. Those are the primary differences between the two. So why are we phasing out the ATP? Because we've added licenses to our USG Flex, which add those sandboxing AI features into your USG Flex. So going forward, you will buy a USG Flex, and you can decide, do you want to use it as traditional UTM or do you want to use it as an ATP firewall? So since we're overlapping the features, we're just phasing out the ATP and just selling the USG Flex. And then we launched our SCR series. So this is something that we put out to compete with, those ultra cheap security appliances you see on Amazon. That are based on consumer type hardware. So we've decided to enter that same space with our SCR series. So these are affordable, lightweight UTM type security routers. They offer certain security features with no license being required for it. And we will have additional models coming out over the next months and years to fully fledge that out. The current model has a built-in Wi-Fi 6E access point, can be used in Nebula with the free version of Nebula. Can do basic VLANing, and again, UTM Lite type features on it. We have also recently, I think we officially announced it at the end of October, the USG Flex H series products. So these are the new models of the USG Flex. Originally, I was told they're basically USG Flex, just faster, but that's not entirely true. They are based on a new software platform. that is separate from what we've been using on the ATP and USG Flex series. So they are running new software. So there are some features that are missing currently or not currently there. One of the main ones is you cannot manage these directly in Nebula. If you have Nebula Flex Pro, so if you have Pro license on your org, you can manage them where it uses the pass-through function to sort of control them. Um, and I think eventually that will come to the free version, and I think January or February. Um, and then over time, we will add the full management functionality directly into these through Nebula, but it's going to take some time. And there's some other feature differences because it's a different platform, some slightly different ways of implementing things. So keep that in mind. USG Flex, faster than the regular USG Flex models with that H on there. But it's a new software series, it's a new interface, and so some of the features are not the same or may currently be missing and will be added later. Something we do differently than most of the other guys out there, you go to SonicWall or Fortinet, you will see that they are also providing their own signatures. We don't do that. Instead, what we do is we partner with some big names who are experts in these areas and get them to provide the signature files for us. So depending on the hardware and the version of UTM you're using, versus Gold versus Flex versus the SCR, we partnered with McAfee, WebRoot, Lastline, Trend Micro, Bitdefender. So big name guys who are experts in their field and can do a better job of identifying and creating signatures than we could if we tried to do it in-house. So that's what we do for you differently here versus most of our competition. And then we'll just talk broadly here about some of the features you will find on our security appliances. Generally on the USG Flex series offers basically everything on here. So web filtering and content filtering, including SSL encrypted sites, application patrol, the ability to create firewall rules based on application rather than just port and IP and all that stuff. So you can just go in from a drop down and choose the app. And in some cases, choose individual features in the app that we can block at the firewall. Anti-spam, anti-malware, intrusion detection and protection. We have collaborative detection and response with our access points and some of the other stuff on your network. Sandboxing, reputation filter, our SecuReporter platform for generating reports and keeping an eye on things. We have our SSL-based VPN client, etc. So license-wise, we have various licenses that are available. We have secure Wi-Fi, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. Single sign-on for better integration with existing or with other platforms for logging in. Nebula Pro Pack licenses are available, Plus Pack licenses. We have a hotspot management license. So you can use your USG Flex not only as your security device, but at the same time, it can act as a hotspot gateway with that license. We have managed AP services. So you can also use your USG Flex as a wireless LAN controller. Out of the box, it supports a certain number of APs. I think most of them support 8 out of the box. And then you can add buy licenses to add support for managing more access points locally. High availability pro, so you can set up 2 of these, and if the main one falls, the other one instantly steps on and takes it over. The ability to convert your USG Flex into an SD-WAN device, and then the connect and protect licenses. So I mentioned the secure Wi-Fi. So what the secure Wi-Fi license does is it allows you to turn an access point into a managed VPN appliance. So the idea behind this is, you've got a lot of remote workers these days post-COVID, and sometimes it can be kind of a pain for people who are working from home to get them onto the VPN. You've got to put software on their computer, and maybe they're remote, so it's hard to get it installed and configured correctly, or you give them, or you, or you give them a VPN appliance, but they've already got a router from their ISP. It either doesn't support or they don't know how to configure it to pass through IP. So you end up in a double NAT, which can cause VPN issues. So this is kind of the solution to that. You assign one of our access points for remote workplace, and you give it to your employee. They take it home, plug it into their existing router. Again, it's an access point. It is not a router. So it works behind their existing router. There's no double NAT issues. and it connects to our cloud, and it creates a managed platform there with a special SSID. So when you connect to that SSID, you're essentially on your local network. Essentially creates a VPN tunnel between that access point to your work office USG Flex, and creates a VPN tunnel for all the data to go through that's linked to that SSID. So for security reasons, obviously you don't want the kids or the neighbors logging on to that SSID. So by default, you do have to use Enterprise, WPA Enterprise Security to do authentication with a username and password before they can connect to it. And we also support using two-factor authentication on top of that to provide even higher level of security to making sure only authorized users get on there. And then I just wanted to highlight here, we have what's called My Zyxel. You create one account and you can use that account, the My Zyxel website, to keep an eye on your customers, see which licenses might be expiring soon, um, things like that. So it gives you one account to access all of that stuff. And then just quickly here, one quick slide here on the SCR50AXE. I already went through all of this. So this is, again, that's just our lightweight new security router. And then the H series I've already talked about as well. So with that, guys, that is the end of today's presentation. So far, I've got no questions. So again, if you have some, send them in with question and answer. I'll stick around for a minute or two to answer them for you. In the meantime, I would like to point you to our YouTube channel. Since we're a global company with lots of different regional sections, the channel you want to look for is Zyxel America channel. That's the one we operate here out of the US. So most of our webinars are going to be recorded and posted there. So if you have to leave one of our webinars or we've got a webinar coming up you won't be able to attend, you can usually find it on our YouTube page to watch it later. We also have some video case studies on there, some best practices videos, things like that. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on it. And then also on LinkedIn, we are at Zyxel US channel. Okay, Doug has a question here for me, and Doug's asking, can I share the presentation? Reach out to your salesperson and they can provide a PDF version of this, or again, you can always watch it and hear my lovely voice on YouTube. But just reach out to your salesperson. So that's going to be either Jacob, Andy, or David, depending on what part of the country you're in, and they can hook you up with that. So Wolfgang is asking, right now, can the USG Flex 200H be provisioned over Nebula? So the answer to that is no. If you have Nebula Flex Pro, we have that new feature that we just added in October that basically creates a tunnel between the Nebula interface and the USG Flex H's uh, management interface. So you can manage it that way, or at least keep an eye on things that way. But as far as actual management with Nebula, that's probably a year off, I think, is the current timeline. Hopefully it'll be sooner than that. But yeah, at the moment, no. So if you're wanting to basically provision it and manage it through Nebula, you want to use the standard USG Flex series, or you want to use the SCR50AXE. So while we wait to see if any more questions come in, we do have user forums. They're at forum.zyxel.com. Once you log in there, you can talk to your fellow Zyxel users. Unlike some other manufacturers, user forums, our team, our product management and support team, do occasionally answer questions there. They do monitor the feedback and feature requests people post. And then on top of that, that's often the first place where we post security alerts, firmware notes, things like that. So it's a handy tool to use even if you don't actually plan to type anything or talk to anybody. Okay, I've got no more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. We do webinars most Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think we're going a little bit light here with Christmas coming up. So I'm doing one on our Wi-Fi 7 APs, and I think I'm doing a Nebula one this month. I'm not sure what Tri is doing, so feel free to join those. Thank you for coming out, and if you do have any questions, just send them to your sales guy. They can either answer them or get me or Tri involved, depending on what the question is. Thanks.